let's go ahead and get started, and I must abandon chat, I fear. And actually pull up my script. All right, we have a recording going, yes. I should make sure before I actually start. Oops, that's not what I meant to do. Let me know when we've got recording started. Okay, one. Give other people a couple of seconds and then get going. Yeah, I don't have a problem with that. It's gonna be on YouTube anyway, so by all means keep a personal copy. All right. Let's go ahead and get going. Ishnu alas, larajna andas befirlai aluirnath salulath lana. Good fortune to you all, and I'm glad that you've come. Welcome to Reconstructing Your Language, a panel on doing exactly what it says on the tin, recreating or creating a language that you've lost your memories of, with minimal help from whatever sources you may have. In this panel, we're going to talk about grammar, word building, not to be confused with world building, and creating new vocabulary words, analysis of canon text to squeeze whatever information you can out of it, and filling in the gaps in that canon text when you inevitably find them. Fandu Senare Dai, who's talking? Alright. I'm a fictive in the Rivalar system. I'm a Kaldarai, or a Night Elf, demon hunter of the world more or less depicted in the Warcraft franchise. I'm in my mid-200s, current leader of the Illidari Demon Hunters in my timeline, and big mad about the fact that I lost my entire language and traded it for one that doesn't actually exist where I'm from. So mad, in fact, that I've spent an ungodly amount of time on reconstructing it, and also written a couple poems about how mad I am about it along the way. But I've put enough effort into it that I figured I could probably put together a decent panel on the subject to help other people get started and encourage them to do so. So here we are. What I am not is a linguistics expert, meaning I may say things about linguistics that are wrong. Everything I have learned either from my headmate Ronnie's experiences learning Na'vi, or in the process of reconstructing Darnassian. Therefore, please forgive me if I say things that are wrong. Please take my knowledge of linguistics with a grain of salt. And if you know I'm wrong about something, please politely speak up in chat so others can benefit from that knowledge. I will not be able to watch chat, however, so odds are good I won't be able to catch it and react live. Sorry about that. Before we get started, there is one important thing I want to make note of. There is a Q&A section in this panel. This means you get to ask me questions, and I'll do my best to answer them before our time runs out. This is very important. Look at me. Look at me. Your questions go in panel questions. Do not put them in the regular panel chat. I will not answer them if you put them in the regular panel chat. You put them in, look at your Discord, look at the channel list. Right above the panel stages, you should see a text channel named Panel Questions. That is where you put your questions. I will say this again at the end for those who joined partway through. Okay, you guys got this. All right, that aside, let's get into it. Why would you want to reconstruct your language? It's fun. It sucks to lose your whole memory of your native language. You might want to write things in it periodically. You might be mad at canon fucking it up. And or you might need something to spend several hundred hours and about 60% of your sanity rating on. No, come back, it's fun, trust me. This is a normal hobby you will invest a normal amount of time into. Really though, there are a few things I want you to know walking into this. First and most importantly, You are never going to get it perfectly accurate to how it was back home in all aspects. Make peace with this now. Unless you have got the best memory of any fiction folk individual I have ever heard of, you are going to have to fill in gaps that you simply do not remember by making it up. The sooner you make peace with the fact that you are going to have to do some amount of reconstruction, the easier it will be to get past the fear of being wrong when you do so. This panel is going to be aimed primarily at fictional languages that aren't quote-unquote proper conlangs, but also don't have zero canon whatsoever to work off of. If you are working with a language with zero canon whatsoever, including languages that aren't from a work of fiction at all, or practically zero canon, this panel will probably still be helpful to you, but I do recommend taking this advice in a slightly different order. Look at word building first. Create a handful of words, 2 to 4 nouns, 2 to 3 verbs, all commonly used. And then go back and start on grammar before you go any further into vocabulary. This will give you enough words to make simple example sentences to test out your new grammar rules without getting in over your head. As you come to new kinds of words, i.e., as you start working on the grammar rules for pronouns, adjectives, catenative verbs, adverbs, conjunctions, etc., make 2 to 4 words of that new type and then figure out the grammar rules for them before you make any more. Don't let yourself get lost in the sauce of vocabulary before you've got your grammatical basics figured out. You don't have to have all the grammar rules figured out before you start really getting into building out vocabulary, but I do recommend getting at least the basics. Then you can get into in-depth vocabulary work. So let's get started. Step 1. Gather up whatever you've got from canon. You're going to want canon words and phrases with translations, canon words and phrases without translations. I personally advise separating phrases from individual words here, because you can still sometimes glean some grammatical information from complete phrases, even if they don't have translations. But individual words without translations are rarely helpful for anything but giving you data on what phonemes, or individual sounds, your language uses and how often. More on that later. You may also want to keep place and people names separated into their own list or lists, as again, these can be useful for data on phoneme usage, but are typically useful for little else, although sometimes you can extrapolate words out of place names. You can also gather related languages, if applicable. For example, with Darnassian, I also recorded what canon has on the other Elven languages, Thalassian and Shellassian, since they all stem from the same root. Oh, and Nazca, I didn't put that in my script for some reason. Make a note of whether any of these phrases are known to be poetic in nature. Poetry often loosens the rules of grammar, so if you rely on lines that show up in poetry or songs, you may end up misled. Step 2. Make any basic, obvious extrapolations that you can. I recommend keeping these extrapolated words and possible grammar rules in their own section of whatever you use to organize this. You can start extrapolating word meanings. For example, if Teldrassil means crown of the earth and Amirdrassil means crown of harmony, you can pretty safely assume that the shared element Drasil is the shared word, crown, which then makes the non-shared elements earth, Tel, and harmony, Amir, respectively. This does come with a warning, though. Sometimes composite words like this like to drop or alter phonemes to flow better over time. However, conlang makers who are only kind of half-assing the conlang usually don't think that far into it, so if you're needing to do this kind of reconstruction work, you're probably safe most of the time. In this example and some others, you can also pretty easily extrapolate a suspected grammar rule, that the x of y, or y is x, format in this language is yx. Try not to rely too heavily on only one example if you can avoid it, but make a note of it. Because in this example, other canon phrases reveal that Darnassian usually wants a possessive to be merged with an adjective, an apostrophe. so it would be tell apostrophe Drasil. But in these and many other proper nouns, it seems to have been elided over time. I'll go into this in more depth in a second in an example. 3. Start analyzing sentences for grammar rules. We're going to start with the process of grammar, because in our adventures with both learning Na'vi and reconstructing Darnassian, we found that starting with grammar is drastically more effective than starting with vocabulary. It makes remembering vocabulary easier, and it makes you feel like you're making more progress. We'll get to vocabulary later. This is why I said earlier that canon phrases, translated or not, are generally going to be a lot more useful to you than individual words. Now you're going to go through your list of words and phrases repeatedly and start analyzing more closely for any grammar rules you can squeeze out of them. This is the part where you are going to have to periodically back up and learn some basics about how languages work. This can admittedly be a lot of work. However, this is also the part where you probably get to learn a lot of new things, which can be a lot of fun and very interesting. My baseline advice: never assume that the way English communicates something is the way every language communicates it, or even the default or most common way. And I don't just mean vocabulary. I mean things like, how do you tell which noun an adjective is affecting? How do you ask a yes or no question? Do you even have words for yes and no? And what order do words go in? And does it matter? If you haven't learned a second language with significant grammatical differences from your first one, you are going to learn a bunch of things that never even occurred to you were things. It's genuinely a really cool process. You know, I'm realizing I didn't take any water in here when I sat down. Oops. Oh well, we're gonna power through. Here's the loop you're gonna go through. Document this process for each loop. Write it down. You will thank yourself later. Pick a grammatical question you want to answer. You can do this at random or because you're curious about how to translate a specific sentence that uses that grammar rule, questions, adjectives, whatever, or whatever. Go through your list of canon information for any phrases that use that grammatical rule, and copy-paste these out into a list somewhere. I recommend including anything that even might use the rule, even if you're not sure whether it does or not. In some cases, you may actually be able to guess that a rule is present in an untranslated phrase. Questions indicated by a question mark, phrases with very similar grammar to those with a translation, look at the context that they're in, etc. Go through your new list and look for commonalities and patterns. Sometimes you will be lucky, and these will be obvious. Sometimes you will not be lucky, and they will not be obvious. Sometimes there won't be any, you will be very unlucky, and there will be 0 canon phrases using the rule you're looking for, and you just have to make it up from scratch. Sometimes you will be extremely unlucky, and the writers didn't talk to each other. So there's multiple canon phrases using the rule you're looking for, but no pattern between them. Ask me how I know. Whatever you find, or don't find, write out whatever patterns you see. If you don't see any patterns, try to highlight what's happening in each phrase if you can tell, and pick whichever one feels most right or what you just like the best. Try applying your new rule to a couple of test words or sentences and see how it feels. If you hate it, try something else until you either get too frustrated to continue or find something you don't hate. If you do get too frustrated, just let it go, move on to a different question. You can always come back later. There is no order you have to do these in. Rinse and repeat. Pick a new question, start over, document the process. Some tips and tricks. If you get stuck, don't be afraid to look up what other languages do with the question you're trying to answer and try a bunch of things out. And that doesn't necessarily just mean fictional languages, I mean this world languages as well. In fact, those are often more helpful because you have more detail typically. If nothing else, you will learn a bunch of cool things about language and grammar and how that all works. If you're lucky enough to have related languages, not related grammar, You can cross-reference with those related languages. You can tell I did these slides all in one fell swoop, if you'll pardon the expression. This may or may not actually be helpful. I found, for instance, Thalassian to be minimally helpful, unfortunately. Sorry, Lorthamar. But it's at least an option. Denalore, what the hell are you talking about? What do you mean grammar questions? What do you mean by that? Well, I mean any question about a grammar rule that you don't know how to use yet. And this is easiest to explain through examples. So, some examples. The most basic type of sentence contains a subject, direct object, and verb. You pet the cat. The verb is the action, pet. The subject is the noun, or in this case pronoun, doing the action, you. And the direct object is the noun having the action done to it, the cat. How does your language communicate which is which? English does it primarily via word order. Anna hits Billy has the exact same words in it as Billy hits Anna, but who's getting bruised is completely different. Notvi does it through suffixes, welierikitaron versus wetierikiltaron. In Notvi, which uses semi-free word order, you can put those words in whatever order you want. Welierikitaron, taron welierikit, yerikitaron well, etc. are all the exact same sentence, because it's the L and T suffixes that are defining subject and direct object. Once you've got that figured out, what about indirect objects, like Barry in I give the box to Barry? Catenative verbs, where the quote-unquote object is actually a second verb, such as want in I want to run. Relatedly, what word order does your language use? English uses SVO, subject, verb, object, but a lot of languages use SOV, subject, object, verb. And other languages may use VSO, VOS, or even, like I was just talking about with Notvi, not care about word order much at all, called free or semi-free word order. Once you've got that basic order figured out, what about adjectives and adverbs, prepositions, conjunctions? Where do these things go in the sentence? Do adjectives go before or after the noun they're attached to, and how do you tell that what noun they are attached to if they end up in between? Things like that. How does your language communicate possession? Note that this may get translated as X of Y rather than Y's X, like how Teldrassil is usually translated as crown of the earth, but you could also translate it Earth's crown if you wanted to. How does your language pluralize words? Does it use a prefix, suffix, infix, or other indicator? And how many plural forms does it have? For example, English only has singular and plural, but Notvi has singular with no prefix, dual with me, triple with pe, and plural with I. How does your language communicate verb tense? And what tenses does it have? We'll get into this in more detail in a bit, so I won't get into it here. Does your language worry about grammatical genders? If so, what genders does it use? This doesn't have to be masculine, feminine, neuter. Grammatical gender can also be things like animate, inanimate, or celestial, terrestrial. My headmate Ronnie made, or half-made, a dragon language that uses those dragons' classifications of magic as grammatical gender: stone, storm, fire, water, life, neutral, and rune. How does your language ask questions, both yes-no questions and open-ended questions? How does it answer them? For example, many languages, Darnassian included, don't have words for yes or no at all, and just repeat the verb either in affirmative or negative form to answer the question, with the negative taking the tie prefix in Darnassian. Some languages have 3 or 4 words instead of just the 2, one set for answering positive questions, like did he hit her, and the other for answering negative ones, like you don't like strawberries. Let's do an example. That last line is not supposed to already be on the slide. Let's do an example and ignore that last line, and I'll walk you through how I extrapolated the grammar rule for possession in Darnassian. First, let's pull together the canon examples we have. I won't go through the exhaustive list because this is one of the few questions where I actually had a lot of material to work with, which is why I picked it for my example. But for a decent chunk, we've got Alanath, Frost Soul, Alarel, Lover's Leaf, one we've already touched on, Amirdrasil, Crown of Harmony, in which I've highlighted which word is which because we can identify that because of all the other Drasils, Teldrassil, Nordrassil, Vordrassil, etc., etc. Anudarini Tala, Let My Will Be Known, in which my will is possessive, so this ends up on the list. Elundris, the Eye of a Loon. And here we can identify which word is which because one of them is a name, which is exceedingly useful when trying to translate things. Kaldorai, Children of the Stars. Yes, I know some people pronounce it Kaldorai, both are correct. In which we can identify which word is which because of all the other Dorais. Queldorai, Sindarai, Shaldorai, Rendarai. And I will note that of these, Kaldorai is the only one that lacks an apostrophe between the two halves, which I found interesting. And Lothar Lazal, Seat of the Sky. So there's a pretty clear pattern here. In almost all of the instances where the words can be parsed out, the possessor goes first, then the possessed, usually with an apostrophe between them, unless it's a word that gets used as a common single noun very frequently, like Teldrassil and Kaldorai. But wait! There's a wrinkle. We also have this, which is clearly a possessive and clearly doesn't fit the pattern. Zinajari, the glory of Ajara. What gives? There are a few possible factors here that you kind of have to think about when you run into one of these words that contradicts your presumed pattern. For one thing, this is an archaic phrase, and it's actually an archaic place name. It's possible the grammar has just shifted over time. It's also possible that the grammar is different for place names. But Teldrassil and the other Drasils are also place names, so that doesn't hold up. It is always possible that the writers simply did not think, or that this word was created early enough that the convention hadn't yet been established in the fiction. I ended up deciding that the first was the most likely answer, especially since that also explains why the Illidari are called that. It's the same ending as Ajari from Ajara, Illidari from Illidan. Literally translated, we are Illidans, with the implication of Illidan's army or Illidan's followers, which makes perfect sense. So, we come up with the final rule in which gets put into my final grammar rules. Possession in Darnassian is typically denoted by possessor apostrophe possessed, i.e. Elundris, but the apostrophe can get elided in proper nouns over time, i.e. Teldrassil. However, in archaic Darnassian, the order was flipped and it took the re suffix, Zinajari, Illidari, etc. This also means we get to add a bunch of new words to our dictionary by deconstructing possessives we couldn't deconstruct before, like Lothar Lazal. We now have Seat Lazal and Sky Lothar. I had to make sure I didn't say that backwards. Step 4. Canon has nothing for me on this question, or maybe this entire language. What now? Oops. So, either canon has given you zero information, or you've squeezed everything you can out of it already and you don't have a clear answer. What now? Well, now you start making stuff up, which sounds so much easier than it is. This is when you turn to 3 major things. Research on how this world languages handle the question you're trying to answer. Noemata if you've got them, gut feelings if you don't. And what you personally like and find interesting and useful. For example, because this really is easier to explain by example, Darnassian tenses. Step 1, is there any canon information? Lol, nope. There are 0 translated phrases that are clearly in another tense other than present, and no way to guess which untranslated phrases might be. So now we think about, do languages handle tense anyway? What is grammatical tense when you really get into the weeds? Let's head over to the Wikipedia article on grammatical tense. Oh boy. This is already more complicated than I thought walking into this question. Not all languages have tense. Some have past, present, future. Some only have past, non-past, or future, non-future. Some languages have 4 or even 6 tenses to delineate time more precisely. Some have a specific historical past tense. But wait, there's more. Going through the rest of the page, we learn that some languages have tenses referring to specifically tomorrow or yesterday, an ongoing action or event. English does this, actually. Something that happened before the speaker's lifetime. Relative tenses, which refer to past or future relative to a time other than the present, such as English's "by then I would have left" or "he said that he would go." And periodic tenses, which refer to something that occurs recurrently in a certain time of day or year, something that always happens in summer or always happens in the evening. And there are a bunch of different ways these can be marked, including, but probably not limited to, inflection with affixes, example, English walk to walked, inflection with stem modifications, for example, the English sing to sang, inflection with reduplication, repetition of the word, for example, and I apologize if I butcher this, the Pingelapese kol to kol, sing to singing, multi-word construction with auxiliary verbs or clitics, for example, the English I will have tried, a combination of the above. I forgot to look up how to pronounce these French words right before I started the panel, so you're just going to have to look at them. The speak to spoke have spoken both changes the root word parler, and adds an extra word. A few languages mark tense on the noun instead of the verb, and a few don't mark tense at all. Overwhelmed? Me too. This is the point where you just have to take a breath and say, just pick something that makes sense to you. I made an arbitrary decision here because I had nothing to work off of. So I decided tense in Darnassian is marked by an enclitic, which for most intents and purposes can be thought of as a suffix, attached by a hyphen when it's anglicized, i.e. senare die means speaking, an ongoing action, as opposed to senare, which is to speak. I also liked the idea of periodic tenses for seasons, and it felt like something my people would do, so I went ahead and added those. Those are, for interest's sake, the periodic vernal or spring tense, near, the periodic estival or summer tense, share, the autumnal or fall tense, ral, and the hibernal or winter tense, thal. So if you wanted to, say, refer to a traveling trader who comes by your town every autumn, you might say din befiral, he comes every autumn. All right. What about vocabulary? How do you come up with new words? You can do this entirely by feel if you want to. You can just start spitting out words that feel right. However, I found that I got stuck on that, and doing some phonetic analysis was what got me unstuck. This does only work if you have at least a couple dozen canon words and phrases to work with, but good news on that. This is the thing that place names and people names are most useful for. This is kind of a slog, I will not lie to you. Phonetic analysis is kind of a huge slog. It has been by far the grindiest part of this whole process for me. However, you will learn things that surprise you, and that can itself be interesting. And it makes it way easier to create new words en masse that fit into the language and sound right. So here we go. Step 5.1. Figure out what phonemes are in your language. This requires going through the whole list, sounding things out, finding the IPA symbol each sound correlates with. For those not familiar with IPA, that is International Phonetic Alphabet. It is a standardized set of symbols that indicate various sounds. For most conlangs that are not well developed, I recommend starting with the list of IPA symbols English, or whatever language the media is published in, uses, and adding from there if there are extra sounds in your language English doesn't use. Because people half-assing conlangs are typically going to use primarily the same phonemes as the language they're publishing in for the ease of their readers. You will get lost in the sauce otherwise. IPA can be a little overwhelming to look at first. Make a list of these symbols, what sounds they make, and what letters make that sound in your language. I really do recommend using IPA for this. I know what I just said about it looking very overwhelming at first, but it's really not as bad as it looks, and it makes things much easier later on. In my case, I had to actually exclude a few words that are in the canon dictionary, but clearly shouldn't be. They clearly don't fit the typical patterns for Darnassian. These are outliers and should not be counted. You can choose whether or not to do this. And here are my lists that I came up with for, you can see the letter or letters, the IPA symbols, the sound that it makes in a word, and the letter or letters that can make that sound when you write it out in the English alphabet, or in the Latin alphabet, I think is what it's called. Step 2, phoneme frequency. Turn the canon dictionary into phonetics, just like we just talked about. Make sure you're using 1 character per phoneme, though, for this, even if in IPA it would be 2. For instance, I use the letter A as shorthand for I, which is normally 2 characters in IPA. Make sure you know what your shorthands are, if any. And yes, you do have to use the actual IPA phonetics for this, because otherwise you will end up miscounting. You're going to get things like unclear answers on how many times any given vowel is actually used if, for example, the letter A can sound like or A, as is the case in English. Sorry. Feed that list into a website or another tool that will count the frequency of each character for you. This is why you need it to be 1 character per sound. I used this website. Worked great. This will tell you how frequently each phoneme occurs in your language, which sounds like useless information and is actually more useful than you'd think when you're trying to figure out what sounds to put into a word. Save this list somewhere. Here are my list and my finished product of how many times each letter occurs, or each sound occurs, rather. And you can see why this is useful, because doing this made me realize how much more frequently that first column is used from the last column. You know just from looking at it that the R, L sounds are used more frequently, but you don't realize quite how drastic it is until you got the numbers in front of you. From here, you can do syllable rules. Go through the canon dictionary, yes, again, and start pulling out individual syllables. Make a list of them, and divide them into type. Vowel, vowel, consonant, consonant, vowel, consonant, consonant, vowel, etc. You don't have to go through the whole dictionary for this, calm down. But you should get a good chunk going, and you'll start to get an idea of what syllable constructions are legal. Just because 3 phonemes are all used in the language doesn't necessarily mean you can slap them together in any order and it'll create a syllable that sounds right. For instance, draw is a valid Darnassian syllable, but ard is not, despite the fact that it's using the same sounds. You're not allowed to put those 2 consonants together at the end of a syllable. They can, however, butt up against each other if they're in 2 different syllables, i.e. Nordrasil. So, once you've got your phonetic analysis done, it is now a lot easier to start spitting out words by feel. And you can check yourself. If you're not sure, you can go back and reference your lists and see if it makes sense. Here are my list of syllables, and you can see what I mean by dividing them into types. And my finalized syllable structure rules. I'll let you watch that for a second. Here's the other wrinkle with vocabulary. How do you actually go about picking words to translate? It may be helpful in some cases to start with words that are common and useful. Nouns and verbs you talk about frequently, conjunctions, prepositions, question words, etc. You You can also arbitrarily pick a category and fill out a bunch of basic words within it: colors, weather types, seasons, summer activities. This has the benefit of letting you think about whether any of those words might be related to each other. For example, I decided the words for seasons in Darnassian are all derived from time of X, something characteristic of the season, and then got condensed over time, so they all sound similar. Gilish Savanir becomes Kilshavanir, Gilish Sathal becomes Kilshathal, etc. Pick a sentence or a longer text that you want to translate, and translate the words as needed, or just start writing random practice sentences and doing the same thing. These will also help you find holes in your understanding of the grammar that had not occurred to you yet. Like, hang on, where do prepositions go in the sentence anyway? Or what I ran into yesterday, what order do adjectives go in Darnassian anyway? I don't know. Think about words that might be etymologically related, and then translate them in groups. For example, I came up with the word sinare, to speak, based on a sentence I wanted to translate, then decided I wanted the word for writing to be directly related to the word for speaking. So I decided to have to write derive from to speak silently, which caused me to also come up with a word for silent, mir, and then combine them into minare, to write, to speak silently. Some tips. Remember that not every word is going to have a direct translation, in both directions. Darnassian and Na'vi have no words for car, because why would they when Kaldorei and Na'vi don't use them? On the flip side, Darnassian has words for time of day and especially times of night that English doesn't bother to distinguish, because English is a language by and for a diurnal species, and Darnassian is one for a crepuscular species. Similarly, Na'vi has words with no direct translation pertaining to Tsahelu, the neural link that Pandoran species can form with each other to facilitate direct mind-to-mind communication, something English has never had to reckon with. And sometimes those missing translations will be more ephemeral and cultural, like how some languages distinguish between forms of love or lying, and others only have one word for each, or one word for all of them. My own name is actually an example of this. Denalore is usually translated as oblivion or devastation, but in truth there kind of isn't a direct translation in English. It is both those things and neither of them. It is the complete destruction of everything and the silent void left behind. Unthinkable loss that can never be repaired. Why did I name myself that? Don't worry about that. I have no history of trauma or depression whatsoever. Fine, I'm fine. I recommend doing a lot of mumbling out loud to yourself, seeing how words feel in your mouth, and continuing to play with them until they feel right, or right enough. Don't be afraid to get it wrong. Don't be afraid to change it later if you decide you hate it. Also, don't be afraid to have words that are homophones. That happens all the time in languages. Although I personally admittedly try to avoid having it happen too often, mostly for the sake of my sanity. It may also be helpful to get into morphology here, because that will make generating new words easier and more consistent. What do I mean by that? Morphemes, particularly bound morphemes, are word parts that modify the meaning of the root word. Derivational morphemes change the meaning or part of speech of a word, i.e. they are morphemes by which we derive a new word. Some examples are un, such as do to undo, which gives a negative meaning to the word it's added to, or ness, such as full to fullness, which turns an adjective into a noun. Inflectional morphemes, by turn, add grammatical information to the word, such as the S on runs, which tells us that it is third-person singular present tense verb, or the S on boys, which tells us there's more than one boy. I sat down around this stage and came up with a bunch of morphemes I thought I would use frequently, and I add more whenever they come up as relevant. Don't feel the need to fill out the entire list at once unless you really want to, especially derivational morphemes, because that can be an extremely long, if not infinite list. For example, here's most of my list so far. I actually couldn't fit my entire list so far on this slide, and as you can see, it is far from complete. I have some missing ones in here. Step 6, sort of. Start writing. Start writing practice sentences. I say sort of because really, you can be doing this the whole time. Writing little sentences as part of your progress can really help you get a grasp on how your grammar rules work in practice, and whether you like them as much as you thought you would in theory. But it's hard to do much sentence writing before you've got some vocab down, so I've put this here as a solid step anyway. These sentences will also help point you to holes in your understanding of grammar, and make it clear which vocabulary words are absolutely critical. Things you can translate include existing texts like poems or songs. Please do not try to make the translations scan to the rhythm and rhyme scheme early on. That's very difficult. Write dialogues between people. Translate things you've already written. Write basic descriptions of things. Write about your day. Or really just write anything that comes to mind. When you run into a word you don't have yet, invent it, and pause to think about whether you want to invent any related words while you're there. Related either by etymology or by meaning. If you need the word for morning, maybe fill out the other times of day while you're thinking about it. If you need the word for good, maybe fill out other quality assessments. If you need the word for a given concept, think about whether it might be etymologically related to words for similar concepts. Here's the big scary thing. What if I get it wrong? This is a fear I have had to deal with multiple times and in multiple stages throughout this process. Ultimately, as I said at the very start, you are going to have to accept that you might, and that is okay. You are not getting a grade for this. You are not getting paid for this. You are doing this for yourself. And chances are, if you're getting this deep into it, you are now the foremost authority on your own language. No one can tell you you're wrong. You can always go back and change things later if you decide you were wrong about something, and chances are it will feel better to have something than to have nothing, even if you know it's not 100% totally accurate. Accept that you are making a reconstruction, not a perfect replica, and forgive yourself for that. Think of it as a new dialect of the language if that helps. And at least let yourself get to the point of being able to build simple sentences before you let yourself get too worked up about whether you're wrong or right. Because at least in my experience, getting to finally write a couple of basic sentences in Darnassian with the new words and grammar I'd come up with was a huge relief. And how good it felt pulled a lot of the worry about accuracy off my shoulders. And perhaps most importantly, when it's applicable, don't be afraid to tell canon it's wrong. Sometimes things that are canon are wrong. In conclusion, finished is better than perfect. Do not let perfect be the enemy of finished. If it feels right, or at least it doesn't feel wrong, then it's accurate enough. I recommend getting at least the bare bones basics of grammar down before you get too deep into vocabulary, but ultimately, you can do things in whatever order makes sense to you. I'm not your boss. Start making simple practice sentences early. They'll help you catch questions you haven't thought of yet, and also help you feel like you're making progress. Never assume that the way English communicates something is universal, and don't be afraid to get weird with it. Finally, here are a few conlanging resources I've used to help me along. Don't get too excited. I included this slide because I knew people would ask, but, well, I kind of only have one. This series really gave me a good starting point, and whenever I started feeling like I didn't know what to do next, I took a quick scroll through this series to get some ideas. I still occasionally look back at it, even at this point. The other resource I've ended up using a lot is just plain old Wikipedia. Wikipedia, my beloved. Great place to just look at the page for grammatical tense or grammatical mood or whatever, and get a really good overview of how it works, often with examples in different languages. Alright, and now we are at the Q&A, a smidge later than I'd planned, but that's alright. As a reminder for those who were not here at the start, please put all questions in the panel questions channel, not the standard panel chat. If you put them in the regular panel chat, I will not answer them because I will probably not see them. That being said, let's take a look and see what we've got. If my computer will let me tab out of this. There we go. All right. How do you know? Can I get a noun? Can I buy a vowel? Could you clarify your question, please? Because I'm not sure what you're asking about. You clearly sent this partway through the panel, but I don't know what slide I was on at that point. In the meantime, Amarakra, there we go, asks, is it weird to both not care if anyone else on this plane speaks the language, but also want some others to talk to in the language? No, not weird at all. I feel that big time. How many words is enough to be a usable language? Boy, that's a good question. And I think it depends partially on usable for what. Usable for writing journal entries in, usable for having conversations on the fly with other people. Different uses are going to require different word counts. I know there is an answer to this somewhere, but I don't remember what it is. I know Tokipona is a very minimalistic conlang that is, I believe one of its goals is to use as few words as possible while still being usable for everyday conversation. And what words does Tokipona have in it, actually? Let me look this up real quick. Tokipona has 120 words in it, and I believe there's a bunch of ways to modify it. The later Tokipona dictionary lists 137 essential words and a small number of, but Tokipona is a very unusual conlang, so that really is an absolute bare minimum. You're probably, sorry, my chair tried to tip over. You're probably going to need closer to a couple hundred to be able to have fluent conversations. Don't let that scare you, though. You will add words as you need them. And also from Amarakra, I'm going to trip over your name every time. Sorry, I said it fine when I wasn't being recorded. How do you derive a word-building system for making technical words within the language? That's a really good question. How would I do that? I would probably start with okay, let me back up. So mostly we know technical words as in medicine because that's our field. And that is typically just very basic words in Latin that we've just decided mean very specific things when used in English, i.e. anterior, posterior. In Latin just means front or frontward and back or backward. But in English, it means something very specific. So I would probably start with those basic concepts you need, which will be things like direction, material, body part, and derive from there, if that makes any sense. So if you wanted medical words, come up with words for pain, inflammation, stiffness, range of stiffness, things like that, and for specific body parts, and start combining things from there would probably be how I'd do it. Will the slideshow be available to download after the panel? Yep, and I meant to put it up beforehand, and I forgot to do so. Sorry, let me do that real quick. I meant to put that up and I forgot, and by the time I remembered, I was halfway through. And it was too late. There you go. For those that don't have a canon equivalent in this world, how do you come up with your first word? I think you would have to do it entirely by feel, honestly. It's what feels right. Just start throwing sounds around, throwing vowels, and mumbling things to yourself until you hit on something that feels right. Write that down, repeat the process at least a few times. And that kind of also goes for Amarakra's next question, which is how to make words that are completely new from the void and not based on any other word. I really do just have to sit there, and if I'm trying to come up with words for sleep or arm or whatever, I really do just sit there and mumble sounds to myself until I trip on something that feels vaguely right, or right enough. If that sounds like an extremely subjective process, it's because it is. Sorry, that's what it boils down to for me. Do you speak with anyone else? Calixa asks, do you speak with anyone else in your language? God, I wish. What do you use it for that helps make it worth it for you? Any other ideas for things you could do with the language that might make one's life richer? I have not done much with it yet because I need more vocabulary words, so most of what I've been doing has been making vocabulary words. I actually just started the other day on writing the lyrics to a lullaby that I remember the melody of, but not the words. And I'm 2 lines in, and I'm already having feelings about that, so that's something. I intend to write some kind of poetry in it, probably poetry without a rhyme scheme at first. You could also write things like journal entries. You can write little fan fiction blurbs in your language. You can write little explanations of things that you did back home. Things like that. As someone with, Valiant asks, as someone with ADHD, sometimes we'll lose focus on the current project we have. This is something that involves at least a good bit of time to develop when I can't read today. When constructing a conlang. So, how long has developing just the base content to shoot off from there taken you? Basic vocab, grammar rules to start with, word order, etc. Boy, that's a good question. When did I start this project? When did I start this project? You guys are gonna get to see my ellipsis doc, because I don't remember. This is a huge mess, by the way, so sorry about that. Not settings. I actually don't need this, do I? I need the properties. Information. When were you made? 10 months. So I've been working on this for 10 months. I've been working on this for 10 months. That has not been continuous, obviously. If you can relate or think of tips, how do or would you stay on track with it and not lose hope as it becomes longer and longer? My honest answer is do it on and off as you feel like it. Don't feel like you need to stick with it constantly. I have taken breaks of a couple of weeks from this here and there, and that's that's very consistent for us. We usually take longer to do that. I might recommend if you really want to make sure you stick with it consistently, try to do a little bit every day. That is the number one thing for any kind of habit forming and any kind of language learning. Do it you don't have to do a lot, just 1 or 2 words, work a little bit on a grammar rule, write a small sentence, just something small every day. Try to make it, if you really struggle with it, try to make it at the same time so you can set a timer for it, or not a timer, an alarm for it, something like that. And also from Valiant, and what might you say for anyone with language processing issues and how to memorize or remember the language and using it, especially as it's expanded more and more? I am not an expert on language processing issues, admittedly, but my answer is going to be the same as for anyone else. It's going to be practice every day, even if it's just a little bit. You don't have to do a lot. 5 minutes every day will do more for you memorizing a language than an hour once a week will. This is always the advice that we have gotten from the Not Be Speaking community as well, so I am passing that on to you. Lily clarifies, you told us to ask you how you know, so I did. Oh, I did make a joke like that at some point, didn't I? I don't remember what it was about. Ask me how I know. I remember saying the words, I don't remember what they were about. I think it was about writers not communicating. Oh, right, yeah. So WoW writers don't talk to each other, is the thing. WoW writers don't talk to each other. So not infrequently, there will be several versions of a sentence that conflict, and you just kind of have to live with that and pick what works and what don't. Viridian asks, I wonder what advice you might have for folks who need not to make something very in-depth, but want to make generally as much as we can for each of our sources. For example, our primary purpose is simply giving name to some concepts English does not have words for, or finding a way to use certain honorifics in system for certain headmates. I think, honestly, that you don't have to take a lot of systematic approach to that. For just giving name to concepts English doesn't have words for, you, again, that's sound out words until you find something that feels right. Finding a way to use certain honorifics. You can work out a system for how honorifics work, depending on, if they're based on job or based on age or based on whatever, then there may be a consistent structural rule. They may all end a certain way, they may all begin a certain way, something like that. So you could form a structural rule for that, if that makes sense. Or you could just have them be seemingly unrelated words, and that's just what you have. I'm sorry if that is not a very helpful answer. Since I am a language myself, people do speak me. That's gotta be an interesting experience. I want to hear more about that. Not right this second, obviously, but how do I kind of balance myself as Esperanto and the work I'm doing, such as making slang and adjectives and more modern words since I'm old, and the technical Esperanto canon or Esperantist reluctance to develop the language? Boy, that's a good question. I don't know. I think I would probably approach that in the vein of, this is a new dialect that is separate from the current, as you refer to it, Esperanto canon. This is just accepting that the version of it that is publicly available, I guess, is not necessarily exactly your version of it. Dialects are kind of a useful concept here. I think that would be my approach to it personally. I don't know how helpful that is for you, but it's at least something to think about. One of my headmates spoke a language in canon that's really more of an English dialect. Do you have any advice on building that ability again and expanding on the dialect so it's useful? For context, it's called Riddlish, and it's exactly what it sounds like. Everything rhymes, and it's not a direct communication style. That's really interesting. I would, if it were me, I would go research existing English dialects, see what things they usually change and what things they usually don't, and how those changes manifest in practice, and base your work on that. That would be how I would approach it. The good news is rhyming is very not very easy to do, but it's at least you don't have to make rules for that. The rule exists. It's make it rhyme. But yeah, that would be my approach, would be look at existing English dialects and go from there. Ooh, we are at time, aren't we? Is there a last second question I could squeeze in? Any advice for finding others who want to speak the same language or dialects in this context? Beyond randomly joining fiction folk servers and putting out feelers. I'm sorry, it's randomly joining fiction folk servers and putting out feelers. I think that's kind of all it is, unfortunately. I would recommend make a server for it and advertise that server places. Places like Othercon. All right, it looks like there's just one more question. So how do you approach loan words from other languages in your source? Analyzing the words, trying to figure out what little of that other language there is. Do these come up often? I actually do have a couple of those. I have a couple from Torahe, which is the Tauran language, and one from the Furbolg language, the name of which is slipping my mind, Ursine, I think. I've so far not done a ton of work on that, and because I am uninterested, frankly, in doing the work to properly develop those other languages that we loanword from, I'm basically just adding those words in a few places where it feels especially appropriate and basing it off what little we have and not thinking about it too far beyond that. And if it ends up inaccurate, oh well. Oh, there is one second question. How do you work through accents? I haven't approached that at all, honestly, and I'm not entirely sure what you mean by the question. So if you want to talk about that more, please come bug me afterward. I do intend to start a discussion board thread on this if someone hasn't already done it. All right, and so we are 2 minutes over time, so I'm going to go ahead and wrap there.